At 600 hours, the Coast Guard cutter Monroe was 300 meters south of Iceland. Locked onto the stern of a 330-meter oil tanker called the Marinera, they were running out of ocean. The tanker was making a beeline for Russian waters. They thought they had enough time. Then the window got a lot smaller. At 0847, a flash message hit the Monroe's Combat Information Center from Subland, Submarine Force Atlantic. A Russian submarine and 2 surface combatants had sortied from the Northern Fleet. They were heading east into the Atlantic on an intercept course for the Marinera. Classification, likely an Akula-class. Speed estimated at 20+ knots submerged. Current position, east of the GI-UK gap and closing. The Monroe is a law enforcement vessel. 4,500 tons, a 57mm gun, and exactly 0 ways to find, track, or destroy a submarine. If the sub reached the Marinera before the Americans could board, the entire dynamic flipped. You do not fast rope onto a tanker's deck while a Russian attack submarine sits at periscope depth a few thousand yards away. Not unless you want to find out what a torpedo does to a ship with no armor. Moscow was betting on exactly that math. Send the sub, shrink the window, and force the Americans to choose. Board now in terrible weather and risk the team, or wait for conditions and risk facing a Russian warship alongside the target. Either way, Russia wins. The tanker reaches Murmansk, or the Americans back off. And 19 other sanctioned tankers that just switched to Russian flags learn a lesson. A painted tricolor and a submarine are all the insurance they need. It was a solid bet. However, Russia has been testing American resolve at sea since the Cold War. Their win record in that department makes the bottom-tier teams of the Premier League look good. Within 3 hours of that flash message, C-17 Globemaster transports began landing at RAF bases across the United Kingdom. At least 10 of them appeared. Ground crews unloaded MH-60 Blackhawks, MH-47 Chinooks, and crates stenciled for the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. These are no ordinary pilots. They are the taxi service for Tier 1 operators whenever they need to go to a very bad neighborhood. At RAF Fairford, CV-22B Ospreys ran fast rope drills in broad daylight. At RAF Mildenhall, an AC-130J Ghost Rider gunship rolled off a cargo ramp. A flying artillery platform carrying a 105mm howitzer, a 30mm chain gun, and the ability to put precision munitions through a window from 15,000 feet. Ocean analysts posted every tail number within hours. Flight tracking sites went white hot. The message was loud enough to hear in Moscow. The United States was coming for this ship, and it was bringing enough hardware to handle anything Russia put in the water. But that was the show. Every C-17, tail number, and flight tracking hit was designed to be seen. The real strike package was already at sea. Riding a ship, nobody was watching. They were waiting for a window that hadn't opened yet. The Russian submarine had to cross the GI-UK gap, the stretch of deep water between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. That is the worst piece of ocean on Earth for a Russian submarine commander to drive through. NATO has been listening to this choke point since 1952. If a shrimp rips one down there, NATO doesn't just hear it. They know its name, what it had for breakfast, and where it's heading for dinner. Every Soviet boat that tried to cross it during the Cold War knew the math. Most of them got caught.
We are losing
the ones that made it through were found later, and that was with 1970s technology. The technology waiting for this submarine was 2 generations ahead of anything the Soviet Navy ever faced. Unlike the Cold War, the Americans didn't have to wait for the sub to come to them. They went looking for it. At 30,000 feet over the North Atlantic, a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon had been dropping sonobuoy patterns since the sub was reported. The P-8 carries 129 sonobuoys. Each one is a small canister that hits the water and sinks to a preset depth. It deploys a hydrophone and listens for what a submarine cannot hide: pump vibrations, propeller cavitation, and the low groan of a steel pressure hull compressing at depth. Think of it as scattering 129 microphones across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Here's the physics problem that bothers submarine commanders. Sound travels 4 times faster in water than in air, and it never really stops. A submarine's pump vibration at 200 Hz can travel 60 miles through deep ocean channels. The sub can go slow, it can go quiet, but it cannot stop the ocean from carrying its noise to a hydrophone it never knew was there. The submarine has to be quieter than all of them at once, while moving at 20 knots toward a deadline. It is like trying to sneak back into the house at 3 a.m. after a night out. No matter how quiet you think you are, your wife is already awake. You're just choosing between sleeping outside with the dogs or facing the music, because sneaking past her was never actually an option. Once a sonar buoy gets a whisper, the P-8 computers triangulate the bearing within seconds. The P-8's radar watches for the other things a submarine cannot avoid forever: periscope masts and snorkel heads breaking the surface, and its magnetic anomaly detector, MAD, reads the Earth's magnetic field. It looks for the disturbance that thousands of tons of moving steel create underwater. A submarine can go quiet, but it cannot stop being made of metal. The American P-8 was not alone. A Royal Air Force P-8 was working the North Sea. A Norwegian P-8 covered the Norwegian sea approaches, and an RAF-RC 135W rivet joint, a signals intelligence aircraft the size of a Boeing 707, was copying every Russian communication in the theater. 3 nations' submarine hunting aircraft were sharing data in real time. The Russian submarine was driving into a surveillance net that covered the entire northern Atlantic approach, and every mile it advanced, the net got tighter. The P-8s were not just watching, they were herding. When the American P-8 got a bearing fix east of Iceland, it dropped a sonobuoy barrier ahead of the sub's projected course. The sub commander went into sprint and drift, full power to 25 knots to clear the field, then engines cut, coasting in near silence. It was textbook evasion. But the P-8 had already dropped a second pattern, 5 miles ahead. The submarine drifted right into it. He tried something smarter, tucking his boat under a commercial shipping lane. Container ships throw off enough propeller noise to mask a submarine in the clutter. For a few hours, it worked. Then, the rivet joint intercepted a course change order on Russian naval frequencies. The RAF P-8 repositioned and dropped a pattern exactly where the new heading would take him. He thought he was hiding in the noise. They were reading his mail. Next, the sub made a hard turn with a simultaneous depth change. This created a knuckle, a column of turbulent water that scatters sonar returns. Against a single tracker, it buys you minutes. Against 3 P-8s cross-cueing from different bearings, it bought him nothing. The Norwegian P-8 held contact without interruption. Last card. He took the boat below the thermocline and cut to battery power. No pumps, no turbines, near silent. The sonobuoy net went fuzzy. Then the American P-8 switched to depth-set buoys below the layer, and it made a low pass with its magnetic anomaly detector. A submarine can silence its engines, but it can't stop being 10,000 tons of steel. Contact regained. Every evasion cost the one thing he could not afford: time. A submarine running sprint drift zigzags through sonobuoy fields is not making 20 knots. It's making 12, maybe 10. Every hour the P-8 forced him off course was another hour the Americans bought to wait for the weather. But the race was not just about slowing the submarine. It was about making it irrelevant before it arrived. By evening on January 6th, 2 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers joined the Monroe. The USS Bulkley and the USS Paul Ignatius formed a formation around the Marinera. Each Burke displaces 9,200 tons and carries an Aegis combat system. They have 96 vertical launch cells and an AN/SQQ-89 sonar suite built to, quote, early retire submarines. One of these destroyers carries more firepower than most countries can put to sea. The Monroe now had 2 of them. Their sonar suites locked the submarine's acoustic signature the moment they had the data from the P-8s overhead. Active sonar started pinging, loud, deliberate, and designed to be heard inside the submarine's pressure hull. If you've ever been in a swimming pool and heard someone slap the surface, multiply that by 1,000. Active sonar at full power is a physical force. It rattles fittings. It echoes through the hull. And every ping tells the submarine commander the same thing: I know exactly where you are, and I'm not being subtle about it. The sub commander was a professional. He knew what every one of those signals meant. He also knew the Americans were not pinging to find him. They already had him. They were just pinging to make sure he knew it. An Arleigh Burke engaging a submarine launches an ASROC. It is a rocket that flies to the target area, drops a torpedo into the water, and goes active on the sub's hull. From launch to impact is roughly 30 seconds. Imagine getting a letter from the tax office, except the letter delivers itself by flying to your house. It kicks the door down and follows you from room to room, reading your violations out loud. It is fast, it is angry, and it absolutely will not accept return to sender. You do not outrun a rocket-delivered torpedo when 3 different platforms have your position plotted. And here is the part that sat heaviest on that commander's shoulders. Once on station, his sub could hear the Monroe right there on the surface. One unarmored ship, a 1 torpedo problem. He could take the shot. But then he would have 2 Arleigh Burke destroyers with his position fixed. He would have P-8s overhead with torpedoes ready. And he would have the absolute certainty that firing 1 weapon meant he and his crew would not survive the next 60 seconds. That is the arithmetic of intimidation against the most powerful navy on Earth. He was there to escort, not to fight. The Americans understood that perfectly, and they were not waiting for him to change his mind. The distance kept shrinking from both sides. The Marinera was still making 9 knots toward Murmansk. Every hour, it ate 9 nautical miles of the American window. The submarine was still zigzagging through Sonobui fields. It was burning hours on evasion routes it never planned to take, but still grinding west. Maybe 20 hours from the tanker's position. Maybe less if it found clean water. Russian territorial waters remained the finish line that would make the tanker untouchable. 3 clocks were all running against the Americans. And there was one more variable nobody could control: the weather. For 16 days, the North Atlantic had been doing what it does best in January. 15-foot swells, horizontal rain, and visibility measured in yards. You can't fly a helicopter in that. You can't fast rope onto a pitching deck in that. You especially cannot do it at night in winter, 300 miles from land. Not onto a ship whose crew has already refused 1 boarding and has no reason to cooperate. The Monroe had the warrant. The destroyers had the sub boxed. The P-8S were buying time. None of it mattered if the sea would not go flat long enough to put operators on the deck. Every day the weather held, the submarine got 12 hours closer. Then, that all changed. On the morning of January 7th, the Atlantic blinked first. Swells dropped from 15 feet to 4. The wind went down. Visibility opened to miles. For the first time in 16 days, a helicopter could safely work over the tanker. It was go time. On the Monroe's flight deck, a Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin helicopter spun up. The morning air was hazy with mist from the storm system that had finally broken. It was the kind of gray that blurs the line between ocean and sky. The MSRT, Maritime Special Response Team, loaded onto the helicopter. They are the Coast Guard's Tier 1 ship seizure unit. They carried full boarding kits, weapons, breaching equipment, and flex cuffs. Everything needed for a hostile ship seizure 300 miles from the nearest hospital. The MH-65 lifted off the Monroe's deck, cleared the superstructure, and banked toward the Marinera. From half a mile out, the tanker filled the windshield. A rust-streaked hull, a peeling name, and the Russian tricolor on the stern that had started this whole thing. The MH-65 circled once to confirm the fast rope point on the forward deck. Below, the pilot brought the MH-65 into a hover over the ship. Then the ropes went out. From the same cutter that had been following them for 16 days. 1 helicopter, 1 cutter. The 33 crew members had been briefed that if a boarding came, it would look exactly like this. Small, manageable, and something the Russian Navy could respond to before it mattered. The captain never completed that transmission because that 2 MH-6M Little Birds they slipped the Night Stalker's signature aircraft, the same airframe that carried operators into Mogadishu and Abbottabad. The crew of the Marinera was now watching 3 helicopters bearing down on them, where the 161st SOAR had stashed the Little Birds on the Monroe before the pursuit even made the news. While C-17s delivered Black Hawks and Ospreys to air bases across England, the build-up every analyst was tracking, the real strike package had been riding a Coast Guard cutter for 2 weeks. Maybe the MH-6 doesn't block the weather, it just moves you through it faster. 300 miles from land, in a helicopter that weighs less than a pickup truck, with armed operators on the outside. Nobody, until they were in the air and closing on the tanker. The first operators on the deck were not SEALs. They were Coast Guard. They slid down thick ropes onto a surface that had been pitching violently for 2 weeks. It was now, for the first time, stable enough to land on. These are not standard boarding teams. They train alongside SEALs and Delta for exactly this. The reason is not glamour. It is legal. Only the Coast Guard has federal authority to execute a seizure warrant on the high seas. That is why a Coast Guard cutter spent 16 days in January storms instead of a Navy destroyer. The United States deployed 2 Aegis destroyers and 3 nations sub-hunting aircraft. They used a signals intelligence platform, a special operations regiment, and Navy SEALs. And the people who actually took the ship were wearing Coast Guard patches. The military built the operation. The military protected it. But the Coast Guard took the ship. They went for the bridge first. Communications secured. Navigation locked. Scuttling capability gone in the opening seconds. If the captain had gotten a distress signal to the Russian Navy, the situation would have changed. A Russian warship responding to a distress call from a Russian-flagged vessel has a very different legal standing than a lurking submarine. The captain did not get that signal out. The MSRT was on the bridge before the crew understood what was happening. Within 90 seconds of the first boots on the bridge, the Monroe had confirmation. Bridge secured, all communications dark. The Marinera was no longer transmitting on any frequency. The captain and bridge crew were flex-cuffed and moved to the bridge wing. The MSRT split into clearing teams and started working through the interior. Narrow corridors, steep ladderways, and red-lit passageways. These were designed for merchant sailors, not tactical operations. Every hatch was a blind corner. Every compartment had to be cleared. The engineering spaces were next. Whoever holds the engine room decides where a 330-meter tanker goes. The MSRT was not about to let the crew scuttle the ship with them on it. The team cleared compartment by compartment. Standard hostile boarding procedure. No room unchecked. No assumption of compliance until every crew member was accounted for. 33 crew members. Searched, separated, and secured. Behind the tactical teams came the evidence units. Chain of custody, digital forensics, and every navigation log were preserved for a federal courtroom. Hard drives were pulled. Satellite communication records were imaged. The ship had been running sanctioned cargo for years. Everything the MSRT collected would eventually sit in front of a judge. Above the deck, the little birds circled in slow orbits. SEALs on the benches. Weapons visible. They were filmed in real time by the tanker crew's own cameras, streaming to Russian state media. The footage caught everything. The egg-shaped fuselage, the operators on the skids, the deliberate circles overhead. Nobody on the Marinera needed a translator. You were standing on a tanker deck, watching the Coast Guard take your bridge, all while Navy SEALs orbited above you. Sitting this one out was the smart choice. If you like this video, we think you'll love our other video about China trying the same thing. Bye for now.